Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Well, welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman. I'm professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Grove City College in beautiful Western Pennsylvania, and I'm here as always with my long-standing good friend and major pastor. That's a direct quote from Megan Basham.
Yes.
Todd Pruitt, pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. I got that word perfect.
You got it right. You know, it always astonishes me, Carl, after having known you for these many years, you still, every once in a while, stumble over just some of that basic information about me.
Yeah, well, it's PCA. It's filed away in the trivia in the back of my mind. It takes a while to pull out.
It very much makes me feel unloved. I want that out there. I would also point out to those who are listening that Carl's much better half, Katrina, is in the room with us. She's being very well behaved. Normally, she's very loud and very pushy. But we've given her a cup of Lipton, which is her favorite tea, and a Mad magazine, and she seems to be doing just fine over there. Hi, Katrina. Katrina's from Scotland, and she's mentioned before in the past what a Glasgow smile is, and it sounds
Glasgow kiss.
A Glasgow kiss.
Glasgow kiss.
It sounds very, very unpleasant. So I want to tread lightly.
You're heading towards one, I think.
Yeah, Carl, I do have to tell our listeners one story. I have a wonderful nephew. He and his wife live in Louisville, Kentucky, and attend a fine church there. And he was overhearing a conversation recently from some people, I believe, that were in his church, and he heard them mention mortification of spin. And he heard them, of course, identify the name Carl Trueman, because Carl Trueman is a world-famous author, speaker, and man about town. And then the other thing they said was, the guy who's with him, of course, referencing me, the guy who's with him is really funny, they said. So my nephew turned around and he said, that guy is my uncle.
And so they said funny and not weird?
They said funny. They said funny. The guy who's with him is really funny. And so my nephew said, hey, that's my uncle. And so I just want to give some sort of a public acknowledgement of the fact that though I may be the funny guy, you're the one who has the name. And I think that ends up at the end of the day being worth more. But I'm just speculating here.
I'm hardy to your laurel, is that
right?
Okay.
Yeah. So my guess is having the name rather than being the other guy who's funny means like better honorariums and that sort of thing. Right?
That's why I live on a Bonvillain yacht in the Bahamas. Yes. So
good.
Anyway, to get on with the serious business of the day, we live in very interesting times. It's an election year in the United States, and the last couple of weeks have seen some very dramatic election results in Europe, significant gains for parties on the more radical and populist right in Germany, very divisive elections in France, and an interesting election in my own home country, the United Kingdom, where the Tories were not quite annihilated but severely damaged in an election where Labour Party have swept back into power with a massive, almost unprecedented majority in modern times, yet with less a share of the popular vote, I think.
What's wrong with those people over there, Carl?
Well, what's happened is the Conservative Party vote has collapsed, but it has not gone to the Labour Party. And in the midst of all this, of course, in all of these countries, the Lord has his people. There are Christians in all these countries wrestling with, what do we do in a time of highly divisive politics? How do we think about church and state? How do we think about, what does it look like to be a faithful Christian, but also a faithful contributor to the civic sphere and to the political sphere? And that's why it's a real pleasure today to have Professor Miles Smith with us. Professor Smith is assistant professor of history at the great Hillsdale College in Michigan that many of you will be very familiar with. And he's recently published a book, Religion and Republic, which is wrestling with a lot of the kind of pressing issues that ordinary Christians are struggling with at this time. As I said, how do you be a faithful Christian witness in times of terrible political polarization, where the stakes seem terribly high? So it's great to have you with us, Miles. Thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Todd, and Dr. Truman, so appreciate it.
It's always a cliche to start by asking, why did you write this book? John Stone Street says that's the laziest question in the book, but I think I am going to start there today. Why this book at this particular point in time? What do you think is the specific contribution that you wanted to make by writing this book?
Well, I wanted to write it because I felt there was just so much confusion about the relationship between religion and politics, and especially how that interacted in the United States historically. One of the things I think was bothering me was, I admit, I tell people I wrote it because I was exasperated. There was a tendency to have these conversations on evangelical terms rather than Protestant terms. I'm not enthused about the idea of evangelical historiography for a variety of reasons. And I think one of the major ones is because it's actually hewed to a sort of revivalist ideology.
You're sounding very much like your colleague Darrell Hart at this point.
I actually share quite a bit of intellectual commonality with who is a very dear friend, Dr. Hart. And I think the reason why it was bothering me is because we are having these terms really almost always on Baptist. We're having these conversations on Baptist terms. And so I think for so many people, their natural reaction to this kind of nationalized Baptistic political order is to become some sort of theocrat or some sort of post-liberal, some sort of Christian nationalism. I don't think either is the answer. I think that in some ways the United States was something very different than either historically. It was Protestant, but very purposefully not theocratic, not establishmentarian. You could call it Christian nationalist historically, but that Christian nationalism would be very different from what's now articulated as Christian nationalism, which I also think is a reaction to a sort of Baptistic evangelical way of thinking. So what I wanted to do is get this conversation wedded to a more historically useful and I think just more useful broadly taxonomy of how the civil order and religion have interacted. The title is very purposeful. I tell people I'm not talking about church and state. I'm talking about religion and the American Republic. And so I think even that is something that people, especially if you're from Baptist brain or evangelical brain, there's a tendency to say, okay, anytime we're talking about religion, we're talking about the church. And I'm actually someone who doesn't want the church to do politics. I think the church is, quite frankly, not competent to do politics. Mm-hmm. I think that and the people who are sometimes very much who agree with me are actually trying to get the church to do politics. So I think that what I'm a pretty I wouldn't say spirituality of the church because that's more of a Presbyterian term, but Anglicans like the idea of the independence of the church, and I definitely agree with that. Independent from the political order in specific ways. And so what I wanted to do is have this conversation in terms that weren't so both anachronistic and modernistic.
Mm-hmm. And that's, you bring up anachronism, which is one of the things that has frustrated me in the current discussion in my own camp of conservative Presbyterians over this issue of the relationship of the church and the state, Christian nationalism, et cetera. Because some of my brothers who want to use or wear the moniker of Christian nationalist are doing so because they look at the Westminster Standards and say, see, they were establishmentarians, and so therefore we must be establishmentarians. Well, of course they were establishmentarians. They were, at their time and place in the world. But some of my Presbyterian fellows take that as a sort of a holy writ that therefore the disestablishment of the United States is a problem, and we need to go back to the days of a Christian prince, so to speak. And that's where I think some of the confusion comes in, is it's not just Christian nationalism, it's Christian nationalisms that we have. How would you differentiate what maybe I would refer to as a traditional historic, quote, Christian nationalism, but between some of what we're seeing in the neo-Christian nationalism movement?
Well, I think what's happened is that there's a specific rendering of of religious politics that's happened in our own day, and I say our own day, sort of after 1980, wherein it's actually two camps of Christian nationalists going to war with each other. When people say, "Why aren't you Presbyterian anymore?" Well, I'm not Presbyterian anymore because it became a denomination full of two camps of ex-Baptists going to war with each other. And so I think what you really see is there's a Christian nationalism that was pushed by, what people call Big Eva or whatever the heck they want to call it, that sort of sacralized the post-war order. And that post-war order has sort of been, quote unquote, weighed and found wanting by conservatives in our own time. And so what they're doing is trying to find some for them useful history. And so I think the answer would be, historically, these things are treated sort of as not biblical. So there's not a biblical mandate one way or the other on these things. Anglicans would treat it as adiaphoron. I think we're right on that, by the way. There's no biblical mandate for a state church. I don't like state churches. I actually think they're imprudent. I think it would be good for the Church of England to be disestablished, for example. But I don't think there's a biblical mandate for that one way or the other. And I think that what you've had is two brands of biblicist readings of political theology, but heads. I notice this isn't, some of this is because of the loss of the main line, the ability to speak in certain ways about the civil order and civil religion without it becoming sort of holy writ. So I think that I've written on this a lot recently. Evangelicals, or even people who are quote unquote confessional now, who used to be evangelicals, really want the Bible to tell them specific ways to do things.
Right.
And the Bible doesn't really talk about politics a lot. I think that's bad news. The Bible's not really about politics at all. And so I think that what you've had is sort of two reactions against each other, neither of them particularly prudent, in my mind, to sort of strip Christianity of its public affect is not good. Neither is it good to sort of turn the state into a vehicle for Christianity, which seems to be what Christian nationalism want. And so I don't think either of them are the answer. I think there's at least an older way to think about it. Doesn't mean that older way is right. But I think, what I call it in the book is Christian institutions. A good way to make your civil order more Christian is to be a good Christian in whatever your vocation is, be that a hospital, be that a school, whatever it is. So, my term I've used in the book is Christian institutionalism. And I think the idea of nations are actually, when it comes to the United States, is not particularly useful. The United States isn't a nation a la most of Western Europe. And I think that's something that bears remembering.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. I try to explain it to students in class that it's odd. I'm now an American citizen. I have two passports. Yeah, well, there you go. Hey, I paid enough tax. I want to vote, man. But it's interesting to me that I have friends who've gone the other way, Americans who've become British citizens, and it always strikes me as interesting that to my American students, I'm now an American, whereas to me, my American friends who have British passports are Americans with a British passport.
Right.
And it's hard to articulate precisely what the difference is. And I certainly don't want to end up with the language of blood and soil, which has sort of all kinds of problematic connotations and wouldn't be entirely accurate. But it's very clear as an outsider that the way America imagines itself as a nation is somehow different to the way, say, an Englishman imagines. And trying to explain to Americans that, well, you call me British, but I actually don't think of myself as British. I think of myself as English. So you're making a very interesting point there, Miles. One of the things that strikes me is the anger that pervades a lot of Protestantism at the moment on surrounding these kind of issues. And I was chatting to a Catholic friend maybe 2-3 years ago, and I asked him, are you seeing the same sort of anger widespread in Catholicism that I'm seeing in Protestantism / evangelicalism relative to politics in the country? And he commented, his comment was interesting, and I wonder if you would comment on this, Miles. He said, no. He said, but then, of course, we never thought we owned the country. And I thought that was an interesting comment. And it took me back home to Britain, of course, because in Britain, the evangelicals, for want of a better term, I think it's easier to define back home, actually, we'll say nonconformists. We never thought we owned the country. And there doesn't seem to be quite the same anger back home about things politically that we see here. And the British evangelicals, for want of a better term, tended to tilt left politically because they were not Anglicans and they were excluded from the establishment. They were excluded from governing the country. Over here, it seems to me that the establishment was Protestant. And that, yeah, I can understand why some of the people with whom I have strong disagreements nonetheless feel angry because they feel something has been stolen from them. Do you think that's a plausible take, Miles, on things?
Yeah, I think I would offer that there is as much anger in Roman Catholic circles. I think, obviously, at Hillsdale, we have a lot more interconnection.
A lot of angry Roman Catholics.
Well, I think the integralist. Integralist is the ideology is an analog to what the Protestant Christian nationalist ideology. So I don't know if it actually has a Protestant Catholic delineation there. I think what I would offer is that there was, especially in as much as people were evangelicals, and by evangelicals I mean sort of your Acts 29, sort of a certain type of gospel coalition, not every gospel coalition, but a certain type of gospel coalition thing. There was sort of a promise made to young believers, what do they call them? The young reformed.
Young, restless, and reformed.
Restless, yeah. So there was sort of, I think, there was sort of an implicit promise made by quote-unquote evangelicalism that this is what you're supposed to do. And if you do this, the world will be rightly ordered and we will engage the culture. And by engage the culture, sort of, I don't know if that meant control the culture, but I think there was an expectation that things wouldn't go crazy if you followed this program.
Right.
And well, guess what? The program didn't work.
Yeah.
So now I think there's this sense that a certain generation of people were betrayed by a political theology that was a political theology that no one admitted was a political theology. I was reared Presbyterian. We didn't talk about politics a lot. So there's never a lot of political expectation that went with church for me. And there's still not, even though there are historically Anglicanism has more kind of nationalistic dispositions in it. So I think a lot of it is a sense of betrayal. The moment that I think sort of encapsulates for me is watching the fact that so much of this is downstream from the 2016 election. And that moment seems to have been uniquely fractious for quote-unquote evangelicals. And so evangelicalism, whatever that is, to me was always more of a socio-political identity rather than a theological one. So I think what you're seeing in the anger is that a bunch of people said a bunch of things were real that weren't real. And it's sort of the downfall of evangelicalism is, I think, breeding post-liberal politics as much as any sort of expectation that they were ever in control. I mean, evangelicals have never been in control of anything. They were never very important. And I think they sort of oversold their influence through the years. So to your point, Carl, I think you're right, mate. Southern Presbyterians, we were at once kind of in control and then very aware we weren't. And so that paradox, I think, was something that a lot of people were comfortable with. I don't know if evangelicals were as comfortable with that.
It's certainly the case that 2016, I mean, I think the OPC, for various reasons, not least our smallness, has meant we've not been so affected by it. But I think the Southern Baptist Convention and the PCA, both dramatically affected by divisions over Trump. It's been very horrifying to watch in many ways from the outside.
Yeah, very much so. I was raised and educated in the Southern Baptist Convention, went to a Southern Baptist seminary, Midwestern, in Kansas City. So I've followed everything very closely. And you're right. I mean, 2016, there's a reason why we keep talking about that, because it really was in some ways a watershed moment for a lot of folks. It's interesting, as a pastor, I have so many conversations about politics with people in my church because, again, they see, quote, that we're losing the culture. Now, there's an extent, I mean, Christians need to be very concerned about things that are going on. Our friend Carl here is highly engaged in speaking into issues that have, certainly their theological issues, has to do with doctrine of man, that sort of thing, but there's real political connections to that, and we shouldn't be surprised. But what I have to kind of help people navigate has to do with the issues of what should the church reasonably expect in terms of power in the culture. And oftentimes where we end up, and you mentioned biblicism earlier, Miles, what those conversations end up being mostly is a conversation on hermeneutics, where I'm helping them try to understand why that verse doesn't mean what they think it means, and why that passage actually isn't addressing this the way they think it is. And there's a lot of that's going on because I think that there are some misunderstandings. And so I wonder how should Christians today be thinking about power? And one of the things that's perplexed me is there are some well-known kind of Christian nationalist guys who are kind of neo-Christian nationalist guys who are suggesting that we have misunderstood Jesus and the apostles when they've written about the church being persecuted and suffering in this lifetime.
I think some of that's true to an extent, but it's not true in the way that perhaps some people think. So, for example, I mean, there's no. I mean, Christianity isn't a sadistic religion.
Correct.
So I think that in as much as we suffer, the Lord has kind of, I mean, you guys are Presbyterians, so you believe that God is sovereign. He's going to bring the suffering.
Right.
I think what you see, especially in the United States, is sort of an idea that there is some sort of cultural, it's almost a cultural mandate to suffer, or a social mandate to suffer.
Right.
There might be a churchly mandate to do that. But this is where I think that both tribes have sort of get it wrong. There's, I think, some readings of the spirituality of the church actually want a churchly, social, and moral and cultural order, whereby the culture, the society, etc., have to do what the church does. If you guys might be parents, I certainly hope you're not freaks and actually think about, oh God, I hope my kids will suffer because I make them more Christian. Right. So I think what we've done. So one brand of Christian nationalists actually wants to really statify the church, and the other brand wants some readings of this quote unquote spirituality of the church want to churchify the social and cultural moral order. And I think those need to be very, very separate. I mean, I am what a Presbyterian would call spirituality of the church. I don't want the church talking to me about politics at all. I don't really think the church understands a lot of stuff, and the culture doesn't understand a lot about church. And so there's a reason why they, need to be sort of in their respective spheres. Where there's a reason why we might say they're independent of each other, but that independence doesn't mean that the church can't speak to something. The fact that it's not in someone else's house doesn't mean I can't walk down the street and talk to them.
I encourage folks. I mean, I've told people, listen, be as Christian. The way I explain it to our church is the church has a very kind of narrow mission, a very specific mission. Christians in the world have a much broader application of that mission. And so hey, if you'd be good on school board, run for the school board. If you want to run for mayor of your city and you have some gifts in accordance with that, then do that and do it as a Christian. As the church, we're not going to be having politicians in our pulpit like some churches do. Our goal is to make you disciples of Jesus Christ, and then as disciples, go out and do what disciples do in the public sphere.
Isn't part of I was wondering though, isn't part of the problem today that politics is so much broader? When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, the big political questions in Britain were, rates of income tax.
Same thing in the U.S.
Mix of the economy.
Tax code,
state
those kinds of things. Yep.
But when the government is starting to legislate trans stuff.
Right.
That's right. It's, I'm a big believer in I don't want politics in the pulpit, but in some ways, I don't get to choose what the political issues are these days. And if I'm going to preach, men and women are different, which seems to me to be perfectly legitimate conclusion to draw from the Genesis narrative.
Right.
I am going to be political. And isn't that where some of the difficulty gets, that actually it's getting really, when Marxists make everything political, everybody has to treat everything as political. Yeah. And spirituality of the church becomes, and again, like Mars, I'd want to sort of affirm my belief in the spirituality of the church, but it becomes a contested category in itself at that point.
The way I've explained it to people is, we as a church, we're not trying to get political. The problem is that it's clear that the state is trying to get religious, in intruding in these issues of humanity in creation, et cetera.
And the church has always affirmed that which is natural.
Right. Yeah.
And I think in as much as the state attacks nature, the church, and this category is important, right? I think when we say political, we're almost always thinking about electoral politics.
Yeah.
Well, on some level, that which is natural is political.
Right.
And this church is able and competent to speak to that which is natural. The church can, civil marriage wasn't around in Britain until 1860. Guess what? The church formed families, not the state.
Right.
And the church baptizes children. And so in as much as the church has some sort of purview over that which is natural, it can speak to those things. I think, the 20th century was the clericalist century, not the 19th. And so what the church in the United States especially sort of took on was a lot of what we might call social and even small p political things, without sort of considering its own limitations. And so I think there's just sort of a pervasive confusion about what is churchly in the United States that makes all of this harder to really draw lines on, healthy lines on even.
Yeah. Well, obviously this is a pressing issue. It's one that people are having lots of conversations with. I know as a pastor, I'm having political conversations with church members all the time because they're vexed, they're troubled, and rightly so. And our guest, Miles Smith, has written a book that I think will be helpful in helping you navigate some of the complexities of the issue, because it's not just about who you vote for. There are some deeper issues at stake. And in this book, Religion and Republic, Miles Smith, I think, will help you well navigate some of those deeper questions. And if you would like a copy of Religion and Republic, then please go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, and you can register to win a free copy of this book, and we would encourage you to do that. If you don't win, and I know what that's like, I never win anything. And so if you don't win, then we would encourage you to go to Amazon or one of the other sellers to get a copy of Miles Smith's book. Well, again, our guest has been Miles Smith from Hillsdale College, author of Religion and Republic. Miles, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And to our guests, thank you for joining us. If you'd like to make a contribution to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals so that Carl can continue construction on his vacation home, then please feel free to make a contribution, and the Alliance will work hard to continue to provide good content for you. Until then, we'll look forward to being with you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.